Seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Amen. On this Easter Sunday, as Artemis II carries human beings further away from earth than we have ever been, I have been wondering about a simple question. What does it mean in our time to seek the things that are above? Lately, I've been remembering Easter Sundays of my early childhood and the people who were there. Back then in Cambridge, Massachusetts, spring was more of a promise than an already arrived reality. But the daffodils and the fragrant magnolia trees bloomed, while encircling the back lawn, massive oaks and maple trees were slowly coming into leaf. Now, my grandparents lived in the same apartment building. I had relatives who lived in the same apartment building for 70 years. And it was an apartment building in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And my grandmother's two sisters lived there, and then she lived there when they retired. And those elderly people, my Aunt Fran, my Aunt Louise, Ruth, Elmore, Matt, Fran's husband, they cherished and adored me. I was the first grandchild, and I remember so dearly how much they loved me and how much joy I felt whenever I was with them. Whether we were baking little peanut butter cookies or playing little card games, I knew just how much they loved me, and my joy being with them was so uncomplicated. We moved pretty suddenly to California, and I never saw any of them ever again, and I missed them so much. And sometimes I play like a big band record from their heyday just to feel a sense of their closeness. Aunt Fran had been a professional musician, and most of her apartment was taken up by this massive Steinway grand piano. In her poem, Music, Anne Porter describes herself as a young child, overwhelmed to the point of tears by her mother's music as she played the piano and sang. The poem ends with these lines. And when music comes to us with its heavenly beauty, it brings desolation. For when we hear it, we half remember that lost native country. We dimly remember the fields, their fragrant windswept clover, the bird songs in the orchards, the wild white violets in the moss by the transparent streams. And shining at the heart of it is the longed-for beauty of the one who waits for us, who will always wait for us in those radiant meadows, yet also came to live with us and wanders where we wander. That one we long for so much, the one who waits for us, who comes to live with us, the source of our joy, that is Jesus. And today we celebrate the way that Jesus continues to accompany us on our journey, sometimes in very clear ways, but other times in ways that are harder to discern. Our hearts long for something beyond us, beyond the brutality and cruelty and manipulation that sometimes seems to be all that there is. The Bible scholar N.T. Wright tells a kind of parable about this. He asks us to imagine a dictator. It's not that dictator that you might be imagining right away. This is a more metaphorical dictator. So this dictator rules a country with total control and he has a rational system for everything so that nothing at all is left to chance. The dictator noticed that springs of water were bubbling up in unpredictable and sometimes even dangerous ways. Now, the water could be useful, but it could also cause floods, and at times it even washed away houses and fields. Sometimes also the waters were polluted. So the dictator decided that he would pave over every inch of ground with concrete. So since people still needed water, he constructed an elaborate system of pipes. He added chemicals to the water to keep people healthy. And the water, it tasted a little funny, and sometimes people reminisced about the bubbling springs, but the plan mostly worked for a while. But a generation later, something like an earthquake happened. The water could no longer be contained by the concrete, and it burst forth everywhere, causing chaos. Now, some people were thrilled they no longer had to depend on the water system. But the people who were in charge, they were exasperated. Suddenly there was more than enough water, but it was not perfectly pure and controlled. So in this parable, we in the Western world are citizens of that country. And the dictator is the philosophy that has shaped our world for the last 2 centuries, and which makes most of us, almost all of us, materialists by default. And the water that is bubbling up, that is what we often call spirituality. As individuals and communities, we thirst for this. And in a world paved over by skepticism, where we've been taught not to trust our deepest instincts, many of us feel even ashamed to admit that we have had religious experiences. Now, Alan Jones, our former dean, was delighted to learn about an acronym that psychologists first started using around the year 2010. And it describes their field's tendency toward a particular bias, to draw conclusions about all of humanity from an unrepresented and small subgroup of research subjects. The people that they tended to study were weird, which stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Now, through decolonization and globalization, we are beginning to see a much bigger picture of what it means to be human and what it means to be spiritual. Now, today it is common for all of us to have a basic understanding of biology, physiology, physics, astronomy, psychology, economics. But let me tell you, I am astonished by how little weird people know about theology. Just the basics. For example, I wonder how many people can speak intelligently about what it means to say that very simple phrase from the Lord's Prayer, "Our Father who art in heaven." Now, the word heaven in Greek and Hebrew, it means the sky. But those biblical writers didn't expect you to go higher and higher in the sky and eventually you'd get to heaven. They had a more complicated picture in mind. For them, they were not just referring to a location in time and space. For them, heaven described the dimension that belongs to God as opposed to ours. Now also for them, which is different than for us, heaven is not just a destination for souls, a place where you go when you die. It is not just a future reality. Heaven is a way of talking about where God is present. So in the Bible, earth refers to the dirt, but it also to our realm, our space, our dimension of reality. Now you may be thinking there as you sit there, hearing about the realm of God and the realm of earth, heaven and earth. How are those two connected? And I want to talk a little bit about what theologians have said about how these two different world pictures fit together. Okay, so the first, picture one, involves seeing heaven and earth as perfectly overlapping. Now, in that picture, God's space and ours are pretty much the same, or rather, they are two different ways of talking about the same thing. According to this view, God is everywhere and everywhere is God. God is everything and everything is God. And the word that people use for this is pantheism. Pan in Greek means all. Theos means God. So everything is God. And the ancient Greek philosophers called Stoics, they replaced the view that there are multiple gods everywhere with this sense that a divine current or power runs through all creation. Now, you may be already thinking about some of the problems with this view. One of the problems is that it's hard to believe things like mosquitoes are God, and you can extend that out to a zillion other things probably. And the other thing is that this view has very little to contribute when we struggle to understand the presence of evil. Okay, so that's one world picture, God and world perfectly overlapping. The second is a picture of God and the world that are distanced from each other. So this regards them as entirely separate, not connected at all. And it imagines human beings as utterly alone in the world. Now, oddly enough, this view puts together people who may not think they have very much in common. 18th century deists believed that a distant God just made the world and then just left everything to run on its own. But that's not so different from the way that many fundamentalists and scientism, people who kind of follow scientism, that's not that different from the way that they look at it either. For them, the only real realm for fundamentalists is the realm of heaven, and the only realm for the scientism people is that heaven is purely fictitious. But either way, that earth and heaven are totally separate. So when you hear people talk about life as if the only purpose of religion is to secure entrance to an everlasting paradise, they are seeing the worlds as totally distanced and incompatible. So the idea that God and heaven are very far off is a common view that I hear a lot in our time. Now, the final view is that heaven and earth are overlapping in points and intersecting at points, but not coterminous. Now, this is our tradition. It is the ancient Judaism that inspired Christianity, and it offers another more complex picture. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian who was killed by the Nazis just before his concentration camp was liberated, he says this: God is the beyond in the midst of our lives. And the Bible, if you think about it, tells stories about this all the time. People who encounter God. God visits Abraham. Jacob dreams of a ladder between heaven and earth. God tells Moses to take off his shoes on the holy ground before the burning bush. God encounters Moses on Mount Sinai, where he receives the 10 Commandments. The ancient writings describe the temple in Jerusalem, a place just like this, as the place where heaven and earth meet. Now, in the New Testament, the gospel writers compare Jesus' body to this temple. So Jesus' body is where heaven and earth meet. Jesus tells his friends that after his death, God's Spirit will be with them and guide them the way that Jesus himself did. And Paul also tells the story of being blinded on the road to Damascus when he met God. So to be Christian means to have a sense for heaven and earth meeting. This happens as we read Scripture together, when we receive communion or baptized, when we enjoy each other's company at a deeper level, when we work for justice, and when we sing together. It happens in the glory and beauty of an Easter day like this one. Another word for this moment when heaven and earth come together is grace. Grace is that gift from God that we are often too wrapped up in drama to receive. Anne Lamott compares God's grace to WD-40 and water wings. She says it finds you where you are and does not just leave you there. So when Mary Magdalene, whose image is in the stained glass window here, first encounters Jesus, she confuses him for the gardener until Jesus speaks her name and she suddenly realizes who he is. On this Easter Sunday festival, I pray that when God speaks your name, that you will recognize that as the place where heaven and earth come together. What does it mean to seek the things that are above? It means that as the springs of spirituality burst out in the most unexpected places, we will be open to receive that grace. Long after they all died, I moved back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I would walk through that same garden where my family celebrated Easter all those years before. And on certain spring days, God was so near, and that feeling of joy from my childhood came back so vividly that I almost could hear Aunt Fran's music again. Shining at the heart of the world is the one who waits for us, who also came to live with us and wanders as we wander.